James Weldon Johnson, Black Manhattan. Copyright 1930 by James Weldon Johnson. To John B. Nail, who himself has witnessed the past 60 years and more of the changes herein recorded, and has been the friend of many of the outstanding characters that appear in these pages. Preface to the Athenaeum edition by Alan H. Spear, University of Minnesota. The decade following World War I was a period of both despair and hope for black Americans. On the one hand, Negroes were confined to the ghettos in the North and subjected to continuing oppression and intimidation in the South. On the other hand, a new Negro emerged, proud, defiant, and racially militant, signaling to many the beginning of a movement designed to lift the black man from his inferior status in American society. Although it had its origins in the pre-war years, this new spirit of militancy and racial pride was crystallized by the Great Migration of World War I. Between 1915 and 1920, thousands of Negroes moved from the isolated backwaters of the rural South, where most black people had passively accepted their lot in life, to the urban North, where they were exposed to the broader currents of American society. The migration created new expectations of a better life that were frequently dashed by the squalid, oppressive reality of ghetto existence. It was precisely this reality which shaped the major thrust of Negro thought during the 1920s. Throughout American history, whenever white hostility has seemed especially formidable, and the dream of an integrated America particularly remote, Negroes have been attracted to philosophies of separatism and racial solidarity. The post-war era was such a period. Race riots, housing restrictions, job discrimination, and above all, the seemingly hopelessness of life in the northern ghetto forced many blacks to question whether white America would ever agree to meaningful integration. The most embittered turned to the black nationalism of Marcus Garvey. Others sought more moderate solutions in the movement toward the development of self-sufficient black communities and the creation of a viable Negro culture. On every level of life, black people attempted to express their renascent feelings of race pride and group solidarity. Businessmen and civic leaders dreamed of a black metropolis that would provide within a self-contained community all of the goods and services required by its people, while artists and writers groped to develop a cultural nationalism firmly rooted in the Negro folk experience. This literary and artistic renaissance of the 1920s brought together many of the principal themes of the new Negro movement. It emphasized the positive contributions of black people, the need for self-sufficiency, and the inadequacies of sycophantic accommodationalist leadership. Young black writers and artists rebelled against an older generation that had been content to imitate the genteel culture of white America. They sought their material instead in the common experience of the Negro people, in rural life in the South and West Indies, and in the street life of the northern ghettos. Abandoning the assimilationist values of their elders, they celebrated that which was special in Negro life: the spirituals, the folk legends, the spirit of mutual understanding that can develop only among people who have suffered together. Harlem was the special milieu of this movement. It was not simply another ghetto, but a unique Negro metropolis that lured black intellectuals from throughout the Western Hemisphere. Its theaters, salons, nightclubs, and forums vibrated with the excitement of a people in search of new modes of expression, and of writers, artists, and musicians shedding the constraints of the past and boldly experimenting with new materials and new forms. Black businessmen, politicians, and community leaders preached a more materialistic version of the same ideology of racial pride and group solidarity. To a degree, their vision of a black metropolis was an extension of the self-help philosophy of Booker T. Washington, and it had firm roots in the pre-war years. But the migration gave new potency to this idea by creating large, self-contained Negro communities in almost every northern city that provided the base for independent group action. What did it matter, black leaders asked, if Negroes were excluded from white society? In Harlem, on the south side of Chicago, in North Philadelphia, Negroes could create their own cities, attractive communities, served by black businessmen, politicians, and professional people, and independent of white control. In an era of oppression, the idea of a black metropolis gave cause for hope. Black Manhattan is a document of the 1920s, a celebration with reservations of both the artistic renaissance of the era and the dream of a black metropolis. Although set in a broader context, it is not, as its author tells us, in any strict sense, a history. Its treatment of the historical development of Negro New York is sketchy, and has now been wholly superseded by Gilbert Osofsky's Harlem, The Making of a Ghetto, New York, 1965. Nevertheless, much of Black Manhattan remains of lasting value. The heart of the book is an impressionistic evocation of the Harlem of the 1920s by an astute and knowledgeable observer. Its most important contribution is its informed and frequently perceptive analysis of the changing role of Negro artists in music, literature, and especially the theater. James Weldon Johnson's remarkably versatile career allowed him to observe at first hand a wide spectrum of Negro life in America. Born in Jacksonville, Florida in 1871, he attended Atlanta University and then returned to his hometown, where he worked for several years as a school principal and at the same time qualified for the Florida bar. His major interest, however, was writing, and in 1901, Johnson went to New York to join his brother Rosamond and become part of the successful songwriting team of Johnson Brothers and Cole. Coon songs and Negro musical reviews were in vogue on Broadway at the turn of the century, and Johnson became part of a lively and close-knit colony of black writers and vaudeville performers. But the attractions of show business soon waned, and in 1906 he accepted an appointment to the consular service and spent the next 6 years in Venezuela and Nicaragua. While serving abroad, he wrote poetry and completed work on a novel, The Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man, published anonymously in 1912. In 1914, Johnson became an editorial writer for the New York Age, and 2 years later was named Field Secretary of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Between 1916 and 1930, as an official of the NAACP, Johnson was one of the best-known Negro leaders in the country. He continued to write, publishing a poetic interpretation of Negro sermons, God's Trombones, probably his most famous work. In 1927, and Black Manhattan in 1930. After leaving the NAACP, he taught at Fisk University until his death in 1937. Johnson was a transitional figure in the history of Negro culture, the product of a late 19th century upbringing. He came of age at a time when the genteel tradition still held a firm grip on both white and black creative artists. But although his worldview was always anchored in the Victorian values of the black bourgeoisie, he himself was a part of the movement to create a positive and vital culture rooted in the folk experience of the Negro people. His Broadway career made him deeply aware of the dilemma of the black artist. In the 19th century, the only commercially successful Negro songwriters and performers had been those who tailored their work to the demands of white stereotypes. They had operated within the minstrel tradition, playing the role of the irresponsible but lovable darky that white audiences expected of them. By the turn of the century, however, the best of the black vaudevillians began to rebel against such blatant pandering to white taste and attempted to create a more three-dimensional portrait of Negro life. To some degree, their motives were those of the black middle class. They desired to present a more respectable image of the Negro, yet at the same time, such artists as Will Marion Cook, Bob Cole, and the Johnson brothers also came to recognize the richness of Negro folk culture as a source for honest and vital art. In Black Manhattan, Johnson writes with feeling and perception about this middle period of the development of the Negro in the American theater. On the surface, the stereotype still prevailed: the shuffling darky and the prancing dandy. But the writers and performers of this era often achieved the truest comedy through the ability they had to keep the tears close up under the loudest laughter. It was during this period, Johnson wrote in his autobiography, that he began to grope toward a realization of the importance of the American Negro's cultural background and his creative folk art, and to speculate on the superstructure of conscious art that might be reared upon them. Johnson's creative writing reflects this general approach. It stands midway between the genteel literary works of the early Negro novelists and poets and the celebrations of the Negro lowlife that characterized the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s. In the autobiography of an ex-colored man, he draws upon his own experience in black bohemia and paints a vivid portrait of life among show people, gamblers, and musicians in the turn of the century New York. Johnson portrays this sporting element sympathetically and takes obvious pride in such Negro artistic forms as ragtime and the cakewalk. Yet he expects his protagonist to do what he himself did, to abandon show business for the less glamorous but more imperative task of Negro leadership. Johnson makes perhaps his most ambitious effort to come to terms with the spontaneous artistic expression of the black people in God's trombones. Here he retains the cadence and style of traditional Negro sermons, but converts them into high art by polishing them up and imposing upon them a formal poetic structure. For Johnson, folk art is to be cherished and preserved, but his own general background forced him to approach it with antiseptic gloves. In Black Manhattan, Johnson views the Harlem Renaissance as a close observer and sympathetic supporter, but as a man who is himself too much the Victorian gentleman to wholeheartedly participate. He is impressed by the powerful poetry of Claude McKay, Count T. Cullen, and Langston Hughes, the music of the great jazz figures of the 1920s, and the joyous song and dance of the black revues and variety shows. but he occasionally feels obliged to apologize for their primitiveness, to praise works for their vitality despite their concern with the low life. He clearly retains the Victorian notion that serious, i.e. respectable, literature stands at the apex of cultural achievement. If, as a cultural critic, Johnson emerges as a haute bourgeois, making a valiant, if not quite successful attempt to understand the avant-garde, so too as a social thinker he stands midway between conservatives and radicals. Early in the century, Johnson was identified with the self-help philosophy of Booker T. Washington. In the acrimonious debate between Washington and his militant critic, W.E.B. Du Bois, Johnson was in the Tuskegee camp, and it was chiefly through Washington's influence that he received his consular appointment in 1906. While on the staff of the New York Age, he generally backed Washington's policies and was at least mildly critical of Du Bois. But, like many northern-based Washingtonians, Johnson was never an accommodationist, and while praising the self-help approach, he also supported the NAACP's attacks on segregation and discrimination. His appointment as field secretary of the NAACP in 1916 was viewed as a move toward unity, and indeed one of his major contributions as an official of the association was helping to end the internecine warfare that had raged since 1903. The Washington-Du Bois dispute was history by the time Johnson wrote Black Manhattan. Negro leaders had absorbed much of the philosophy of both camps, and while Washington's accommodationism had been generally rejected, even Du Bois now emphasized the importance of building strong black organizations and institutions. The Garveyites, who totally rejected integration, and the Socialists, who totally rejected separatism in any form, operated outside of the general consensus, but they were the only major exceptions. Johnson was, characteristically, right in the middle. As secretary of the NAACP, he played a leading role in the ongoing struggle to end segregation and discrimination through legal means, but at the same time he shared with most of the black leaders of the 1920s a faith in the idea of the black metropolis. Harlem, he believed, had the potential for becoming such a community. It was not a fringe nor a slum, nor is it a quarter consisting of dilapidated tenements. It is a section of new law apartment houses and handsome dwellings, with streets as well paved, as well lighted, and as well kept as in any other part of the city. Page 146. Negroes were acquiring property, developing their own businesses, and achieving a significant degree of political independence. All of this had been achieved without violence and race friction. As it affects Harlem as a community, has grown less and less each year for the past 10 years. Page 156. But Johnson's vision of Harlem was more a dream than a reality. Before World War I, Harlem had been, to be sure, a community of great promise, the finest neighborhood that Negroes had ever occupied in an American city. By 1930, however, conditions had badly deteriorated. The most profound change that Harlem experienced in the 1920s, writes Gilbert Osofsky, was its emergence as a slum. Largely within the space of a single decade, Harlem was transformed from a potentially ideal community to a neighborhood with manifold social and economic problems called deplorable, unspeakable, incredible. Rents were high and wages low. Many homes were in a state of total disrepair, disease, crime, family instability, and drug addiction were among the commonplaces of daily life. And if racial tension had declined, it was because whites had succeeded in their purpose. They had confined blacks to a separate, self-contained section of New York, limited them for the most part to menial jobs, and cut them off from the mainstream of the city's political and social life. Rather than a black metropolis, Harlem was a black ghetto. Its institutions and services were inferior to those of the white community, its businesses small and underfinanced, its political organizations unresponsive to the needs of the people. Above all, it was never self-sufficient, but remained dependent upon the economic and political power of white New York. Johnson's failure to see the realities of ghetto life was the result of his own worldview and of the racial ideology to which he subscribed. Throughout his life, he clung to a 19th century conception of progress and to a firm belief that history moves on steadily upward. Specifically, he was an irrepressible optimist about the future of the black man in America, and he pounced upon every shred of evidence that would confirm his contention that conditions were improving. A proper Victorian gentleman, he was frequently blind to the unpleasant aspects of life. He shared his optimism with many Negro leaders of the 1920s who found in the artistic ferment of the decade, in the new interest of white intellectuals in Negro creative activities, and in the dream of a black metropolis, sources of hope for a better future. Ironically, Johnson completed Black Manhattan on the very eve of the Great Depression. Within months after the publication of the book, the tragedy of Harlem would lie exposed, visible even through the rosiest lenses. For with economic collapse, Black Manhattan's Tinsley facade was punctured. Black-owned businesses failed. The theaters and cabarets closed down. The writers and artists turned from celebration of the black man's past to bitter protest against a seemingly hopeless present. In Osofsky's words, the myth world of the 20s had ended. Black Manhattan is in many ways a period piece, dated almost as soon as it is written. Its sanguine tone seems naive today, yet it does evoke an era in Negro life and thought, an era in which a new and better life for black Americans seemed just beyond the horizon. It reveals a great deal about the mind of a man who made a major contribution to both Negro literature and Negro organizational activities. It provides us with an intimate account of the black theatrical and musical world of which Johnson had been a part, and it raises searching questions about the black man's struggle to find his identity. Johnson's formulations may seem out of date, but the central problem with which he grapples is not. The quest for a viable Negro culture and the dream of independent, black-controlled communities are very much a part of current racial thought. Like James Weldon Johnson, today's leaders must deal with the tension between the black man's desire to be an American and his desire to be a Negro, for this eternal cultural dualism remains at the heart of what it means to be black in American society. Preface. It has not been my intention to make this book in any strict sense a history. I have attempted only to etch in the background of the Negro in latter-day New York, to give a cutback and projecting a picture of Negro Harlem. I have avoided statistical data and included only as much of documentation as seemed to me necessary for my main purpose, and I have refrained from repeating expansively matter already easily accessible in published form. The story here related sometimes runs much beyond the boundaries of Manhattan, but only when I have felt that the main threads of interest led out from New York or from without back to it. Since the text of the book was put in print, the announced production of Othello with Paul Robeson in the title role, referred to on page 196, has taken place. He opened in London at the Savoy Theatre May 19, 1930, with triumphant success. Also, the record held for 46 years by Isaac Murphy, referred to on page 61, was on May 17, 1930, equaled by Earl Sand. I wish here to make acknowledgment to Miss Rashetta G. Randolph for her valuable assistance in the gathering and sifting of historical data, to Mr. William H. Foster and Mr. Irving Jones for furnishing and corroborating from their intimate knowledge many of the facts regarding the era of professional sports and of bohemian life in the 80s and 90s and the middle period of theatrical development. I wish also to acknowledge my indebtedness for source material to the Arthur A. Schomburg collection, in which is included the photostat copy of the Ira Aldridge scrapbook made by Mr. Schomburg, to the Julius Rosenwald Fund and its president, Mr. Edwin R. Embry. I wish to express my especial thanks for the grant of the fellowship which has made possible the writing of the book. J.W.J., New York City, 1930. Black Manhattan. Chapter 1. The fact that within New York, the greatest city of the New World, there is found the greatest single community anywhere of people descended from age-old Africa, appears at a thoughtless glance to be the climax of the incongruous. Harlem is today the Negro metropolis, and as such is everywhere known. In the history of New York, the name Harlem has changed from Dutch to Irish to Jewish to Negro, but it is through this last change that it has gained its most widespread fame. Throughout colored America, Harlem is the recognized Negro capital. Indeed, it is Mecca for the sightseer, the pleasure seeker, the curious, the adventurous, the enterprising, the ambitious, and the talented of the entire Negro world. For the lure of it has reached down to every island of the Carib Sea and penetrated even into Africa. It is almost as well known to the white world, for it has been much talked and written about. So here we have Harlem, not merely a colony or a community or a settlement, not at all a quarter or a slum or a fringe, but a black city, located in the heart of white Manhattan, and containing more Negroes to the square mile than any other spot on earth. It strikes the uninformed observer as a phenomenon, a miracle straight out of the skies. But the seeming incongruity and wonder of this black metropolis in the heart of the great western white metropolis grows less and less and disappears as we glance backward from Harlem and become familiar with the story of the Negro in the city and state of New York. The anomaly of the situation starts to fade out the moment we take account of how far back the story begins. Henry Hudson, under the flag of the Dutch East India Company, sailed up the Hudson River in 1609. The Dutch West India Company was established in 1614, and New Netherland was founded as a Dutch colony in 1623. Governor Peter Minuit bought Manhattan Island from the Indians and established the settlement of New Amsterdam, New York City, in 1626. Within the same year, there were 11 Negroes in the colony, constituting a little above 5% of the total non-Indian population. There is a record of the names of 4 of these 11 Negroes: Paul de Angola, Simon Congo, Anthony Portuguese, and John Francisco. These names appear to have some bearing on the origins of the men who bore them, and they also carry a suggestion of romance. What was the history of these first Negroes landed on Manhattan? There is nothing to tell the tale. The 11 were all men, and the probabilities are that they were captured seamen, for the Dutch West India Company was actually a naval power and waged war upon the high seas. These Negroes were landed at New Amsterdam and made bondservants. But there were instances at a later date when Dutch commanders, not knowing what to do with them, let captured blacks go free. 2 years later, 3 Negro women were landed at New Amsterdam. Under a system of patronship, the number of Negroes in the colony increased, but only slowly, and it was not until a definite system of slavery was established that it grew rapidly. Slavery was never quite profitable in New Netherland under the Dutch, so it never actually flourished. But the Dutch surrendered to the English in 1664, and under the English, who had found slave labor profitable in Virginia, slavery became an institution in New York. 30 years after the English occupation of the colony, there were 2,170 Negroes in New York, a little more than 13% of the whole colonial population. Under English rule, the trade in black human beings was extended and became lucrative. The laying out of plantations in Westchester County and on Long Island and Staten Island was an important factor in the development of the trade. The settling of whites and blacks on the land in these 3 sections began at the same time. In 1709, a slave market was established at the foot of Wall Street. Slavery under the Dutch was comparatively mild. The Dutch West India Company in 1644 manumitted 11 Negro slaves who had been long in its service. It is interesting to take their names from the record, if for no other reason than they shed an additional light on the original 11. The names of those manumitted because they had, quote, served the company 17 or 18 years, and had been, quote, long since promised their freedom on the same footing as other free peoples here in New Netherland, end quote, were Paul de Angola, Big Manuel, Little Manuel, Manuel de Gerrit de Rennes, Simon Congo, Anthony Portuguese, Gracia, Peter Santome, John Francisco, Little Anthony, John Fort Orange. The manumission of these 11 slaves marked a cardinal epoch in the history of the Negro in New York, the beginning of a colony of black free men in the midst of slavery. This policy of manumission was followed by numbers of individuals. Slaves in New Netherland differed but little from indentured servants. They had almost full freedom of motion and assembly. They were allowed to marry. Wives and daughters had legal protection against the lechery of masters, and they had the right to acquire and hold property. Slaves in New Netherland never became mere merchandise, nor did the slave system ever reach the dehumanized stage which it reached in the English-speaking colonies and states. Perhaps the system under the Dutch lacked, among other things, sufficient time for development. Be that as it may, under the English, slavery in the colony flourished, and took on all the harsh and cruel traits of the system farther south. Laws were enacted annulling those few rights which the slaves had possessed, and the most severe restrictions and drastic practices were adopted. The slaves had been far from content under the soft system of the Dutch. They were continually striving for freedom through manumission. It was upon their own petition that the first group was manumitted. As conditions grew harsher, they tried swifter methods. They escaped to Canada or ran away and took refuge with the Indians. In 1705, the General Assembly found it necessary to pass an act forbidding all Negro slaves from, quote, traveling 40 miles above the city of Albany, at or above a place called Saratoga, or Saratoga, on pain of death, end quote, unless accompanied by master or mistress. Later, a treaty was made with the Six Nations, in which these Indian tribes agreed to deliver up all Negro slaves that might take refuge among them. Such treaties were never lived up to by the Indians. The increasing cruelty of slavery was attended by the increasing bitterness and resentment of the slaves, until, driven to the extreme, they struck a blind blow at their oppressors. The blow, of course, was futile. Indeed, it was followed by laws and practices still more severe and galling. In striking it, however, the Negro wrote his first full-length page in New York history, and a bloody page it is. The report on the, quote, Negro insurrection of 1712, end quote, made by Governor Robert Hunter to the Lords of Trade, may be paraphrased briefly. On April 6, 1712, 23 Negro slaves met about midnight in the orchard of one Mr. Cook in the middle of the town, for the purpose of destroying as many of the inhabitants as they could, to revenge themselves for the hard usage they felt they had received from their masters. Some of them were armed with firearms, some with swords, and others with knives and hatchets. One of them, Coffee or Cuffy, slave of one Peter Van Tillenburg, set fire to an outhouse of his master, whereupon the whole band sallied forth and marched to the fire. News of the fire spread through the town, and a crowd of townspeople flocked to it. The band of insurgents opened fire on the crowd, killing 9 citizens and wounding 5 or 6 others. Alarm was given. The governor ordered a detachment from the fort to march against the revolting slaves, but they, under cover of night, made their escape into the woods. The governor, by placing sentries and having the militia of New York and Westchester counties drive the island, captured all the rebels except 6 who preferred suicide to capture. In the trial before justices, 27 were condemned. 21 were executed. Quote, some were burnt, others hanged. 1 broke on the wheel, and 1 hung alive in the town. The governor did not strain his words in saying, there has been the most exemplary punishment inflicted that could be thought of. 29 years later, the city was again thrown into a panic by the so-called conspiracy to burn New York and murder its inhabitants. On March 18, 1741, the fort at what is now the Battery was destroyed by fire. A number of fires followed in quick succession throughout the town. Wild rumors began to fly that the fires were the result of a slave conspiracy to destroy the city and massacre the whites. Negroes were arrested wholesale and put into prison, but no clue to the origin of the fires could be found. The mystery was deepened by the fact that none of the fires was connected with any attempt at violence. A month or so after the burning of the fort, Mary Burton, a white indentured servant to John Hewson, an innkeeper, was called before the grand jury to testify regarding a robbery which, it was alleged, had been planned in her master's place. The jury came to feel that in Mary Burton they had the key to the mystery of the fires. The girl at first refused to give any testimony on that point, but under pressure she told a story that involved 3 Negroes known as Cesar, Prince, and Coffee, or Cuffy, not only in the robbery, but also in the conspiracy to burn the town, massacre the whites, and make themselves the rulers. She testified that the 3 had met often at her master's house to lay these plans. In her story she also implicated John Hewson, her master, Sarah Hewson, her master's wife, and another white woman named Peggy Carey, known as the Irish Beauty, who lived at Hewson's and was the kept mistress of Cesar, having a child by him. It cannot be known how trustworthy Mary Burton's testimony was, but through it scores of persons were eventually involved in the charge. The trial was held in an atmosphere of apprehension and terror. There were, of course, many persons alive who had vivid recollections of the insurrection of 1712. In such an atmosphere, justice could not have a breathing chance. Many a time has a legal trial served as a sort of substitute for a Roman circus for New Yorkers, but without doubt no other legal show has ever approached this 1741 trial in sensationalism and importance. And it is certain that not only New York, but every other slave-holding community in the country was deeply interested in the outcome. So important was this case deemed that Chief Justice Horace Mandan in 1744 published a journal of the proceedings against the conspirators. This volume was republished in England in 1748, and in 1810 it was republished in New York as A History of the Negro Plot, a book of nearly 400 pages. The chief purpose of this book was to justify the drastic punishments that had been meted out. As a result of the trial, 18 were hanged, 14 were executed in the manner of one Tom, who was condemned to be, quote, burned alive with a slow fire until he is dead and consumed to ashes, end quote. In addition, 70-odd Negroes were transported out of the country. Among those hanged were John Hewson and his wife, the white girl Peggy, and an Englishman, a priest named John Urey. After the conspiracy of 1741, the state of the Negro in New York sank to the nadir. But in the last quarter of the century, a change in sentiment regarding slavery began to make itself felt. The doctrine of the Declaration of Independence was not without some collateral effect upon the status of the black man. During the Revolutionary War, the legislature of New York passed an act granting freedom to all slaves who served in the army for 3 years or until honorably discharged. Later, a bill was passed providing for 2 Negro regiments. Colored men of New York formed a good proportion of the nearly 4,000 Negro soldiers that fought in the colonial armies. At the close of the Revolutionary War, to be more precise, according to the census of 1790, there were 25,978 Negroes in the state of New York, 21,324 slaves, and 4,654 freemen. Chapter 2. The spirit of the Revolution not only wrought in New York a humanization of sentiment, regarding slavery and a softening of the condition of the slave, but also aroused and strengthened a considerable section of public opinion and set it in motion against the whole institution. In January 1785, 4 years after the close of the war, 19 men met and organized the Society for the Promotion of the Manumission of Slaves and Protecting Such of Them as Have Been or May Be Liberated. Among the purposes of the society as set forth were those of defending the rights of the blacks and giving them the elements of education. At the second meeting, John Jay and Alexander Hamilton were present, and at a meeting held later, Jay was chosen president of the society and Hamilton secretary. The Quakers, it is true, 18 years earlier, had publicly gone on record as opposing slavery. Purchase Quarterly Meeting in 1767 sent a statement to the yearly meeting held in Flushing propounding the following question: if it is not consistent with Christianity to buy and sell slaves, is it consistent with the Christian spirit to keep those in slavery that we have already in our possession by purchase, gift, or any otherwise? Slaveholding as a question of religion and morals was constantly considered in the meetings of the Quakers, and by 1779 the last slave held by a friend was set free. The example of the Quakers influenced individuals outside the sect, but it was the formation of the Manumission Society that marked in New York the beginning of an organized anti-slavery effort, general in character and scope. The Manumission Society at once set for itself the task of having the legislature pass an act leading to the abolishment of slavery in New York, and continued to work at that task until it was finally accomplished. The legislature passed an act in 1799 providing for gradual emancipation. The provisions of the act were that every male child born of a slave after July 4th, 1799, should be free after 28 years of service to the owner of its mother, and every female child after 25 years of such service. The abolition of slavery was continually agitated, and several midway measures were adopted. Finally, on July 4th, 1827, an act was passed by which all slaves were emancipated and slavery was abolished in the state of New York. By the census of 1830, there were 44,870 free Negroes in New York State, 14,083 of them living in the city. The reader, however, must not be left to think that New York led the way toward the abolition of slavery in the North. In fact, New York was the last of the northern states, except New Jersey, to emancipate the slaves. But although New York was late in taking the legal step to abolish slavery within the state, it became one of the strongholds of the forces fighting to abolish slavery in the nation, and one of the important stations on the Underground Railroad. Moreover, it became the chief center of the free Negroes who played an active and effective part in bringing about national abolition. For in the same year in which New York State abolished slavery, in fact, 3 months before the passage of the act, the first Negro newspaper in the United States made its appearance in New York City. Freedom's Journal was its name, and its name embodied its purpose. Freedom's Journal was in every sense an organ of propaganda. It was established for the sole and definite purpose of fighting to end slavery and to secure American citizenship for the Negro. Within the period Between the founding of this first newspaper and the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, some 24 newspapers were established and published by Negroes in various northern states. All these publications had the same single aim: the overthrow of slavery. For certain reasons, New York was the most favorable field for these organs of agitation and propaganda. Out of the whole number published in the country during the abolition period, 12 were published in New York State, and of these, 8 were published in New York City, the others in Albany, Troy, Syracuse, and Rochester. It is astounding on glancing backward to see how well written and edited were the majority of these periodicals. They stated and pleaded their cause with a logic and an eloquence which seldom fell below the highest level of the journalism of the period. And yet it is not, after all, astounding. There was the great cause, the auspicious time, and by some curiously propitious means there were too the men able to measure up to the cause and the time. There were among the editors of these papers, especially in New York, men of ability and men of learning. The founder and editor of Freedom's Journal was John B. Russwurm. Russwurm was a graduate of Bowdoin College, the first Negro to graduate from a college in the United States. Dr. James McCune Smith, who edited one of the papers published in New York City, was educated at the University of Glasgow. The Reverend Henry Highland Garnett, who edited the Clarion of Troy, was the pastor, unbelievable as it may sound, of a white church in that city. He also had the distinction of delivering in the House of Representatives at Washington on Lincoln's birthday, 1865, a memorial address on the adoption by Congress of the amendment to the Constitution abolishing slavery. The Reverend Samuel Ringgold Ward, who edited The Impartial Citizen at Syracuse, was a marvelous orator, and for years the pastor of a white congregational church at Cortlandville. And there was the great Frederick Douglass, who established and edited the North Star at Rochester. A half-dozen others were of much more than ordinary training. These newspapers quickened and united the free Negroes of the North and did a great deal to arouse and influence public opinion against slavery. The free Negroes of the North actually became one of the strongest arguments against slavery. Many of the Negro anti-slavery papers were short-lived. Only one of them survived the period and is alive today. The Christian Recorder, established in Philadelphia in 1856, is still published there as the official organ of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Frederick Douglass's paper was the strongest and most influential of them all. The North Star was read not only by colored people, but by many whites, and was without question one of the most powerful of all the anti-slavery publications. Douglass's international fame as an abolitionist and an orator naturally gave his paper great prestige. The North Star did long service. It was first issued November 1st, 1847, and continued to be published later as Frederick Douglass's paper until it was able to announce the emancipation of the slaves. At the outbreak of the Civil War, and even more sanguinely at the emancipation of the slaves, the Negro press felt that the fight had been completely won. The error was pardonable. It was entirely human to regard so great a victory after so long and hard a struggle as conclusive. The end of the Civil War marked the disappearance of the Negro anti-slavery newspaper and the close of the first period of Afro-American journalism. But the efforts of the free Negroes of New York against slavery were not limited to those made through their newspapers. New York Negroes played an important part in the Underground Railroad system. They made frequent use of organized protests and resorted to the law and the courts whenever they were able. On September 18th, 1850, the Fugitive Slave Bill passed by Congress became a law, and the first act for its enforcement was done in New York. On the 26th of the same month in which the law became effective, an enforcement officer arrived in New York from Baltimore to claim James Hamlet, who, he made affidavit, was a slave belonging to Mary Brown of Baltimore, and had made his escape to New York. The United States Commissioner issued, under the Fugitive Slave Law, the warrant that was demanded for the arrest of Hamlet. The warrant was executed, and Hamlet was arrested while working as a porter in a store at 58 Water Street and taken back to Baltimore. At the same time, it was announced that his owner would allow him to be redeemed for $800. The colored people of the city at once took action. A mass meeting was called and advertised by a handbill which read, "The Fugitive Slave Bill, the panting slave, freedmen to be made slaves. Let every colored man and woman attend the great mass meeting to be held in Zion Church, street corner of Leonard, on Tuesday evening, October 2nd, 1850. For your liberty. Your fireside is in danger of being invaded. Devote this night to the question of your duty in the crisis. Shall we resist the proposition? Shall we defend liberties? Shall we be freedmen or slaves? By order of the Committee of 13. The absence of superstitious fear in having the meeting called by a Committee of 13 was justified. Zion Church, which held about 1,500, was jammed. Speeches were made and resolutions adopted denouncing the law and attacking its constitutionality. But unlike so many mass meetings, this one did not merely give an occasion for speeches and resolutions. The sum of $800 was raised, the first $100 of which was given by a colored man named Isaac Hollenbeck. Hamlet's freedom was purchased, and he was brought back to New York amidst the overwhelming rejoicings of the colored people of the city. At the close of the Civil War, there were more than 50,000 Negroes in New York State, about 15,000 of them living in New York City. Chapter 3. No great amount of research is required to find that one of the chief reasons for the intelligent and aggressive action of New York Negroes and for their position of leadership during the period between the Revolutionary and the Civil Wars lay in education. The history of education among them goes back as far as 1704. As early as that, a missionary society founded in England undertook the religious training of the slaves in New York City. The work was carried on for nearly 20 years by Elias Niel, a Frenchman. The instruction was primarily religious, but a number of slaves gained a rudimentary education through being taught the alphabet and how to read the catechism. Several other missionary efforts of a similar kind were begun and carried on down to the beginning of the Revolution. Secular education for the Negroes of New York began with the establishment of the African Free School, which was founded by the Manumission Society and opened on November 1st, 1787. Here again, however, it must be noted that work by the Quakers preceded the work of the Manumission Society. When the Quakers set their slaves free, they made provisions for the education of the black youth. Nor did these provisions for the slaves they had set free fully satisfy their consciences. The Quakers of Purchase settled their emancipated slaves on lands in the town of Harrison in Westchester County, and there was begun a Negro community of which a vestigium still remains in the northern part of White Plains. Systematic schooling among the Negroes of New York began, however, with the establishment of the African Free School by the Manumission Society in 1787. The school was opened in a single room, and the first classes were taught by Cornelius Davis, who gave up a school for white children to take charge of this school for black children. The first building for the school was erected on Cliff Street in 1796. In 1797, 1798, and 1800, the corporation of the city made small grants to the school, and in 1801, the state legislature appropriated $1,565.78. It is a curious historical fact that the establishment of the African Free School gave the black children of New York a free school some years before there was any such institution for white children. In truth, this school was the precursor of the New York public school system. The Cliff Street building was burnt down in 1814, but the corporation of the city again came to the aid of the society and made a grant of a lot on William Street near Duane, where a, quote, commodious brick building was erected. In 1815, African Free School No. 2, with accommodations for 500 pupils, was built on Mulberry Street near Grand in 1820. By 1834, there were 7 of these African free schools, and several colored men and women had been installed among the teachers. The schools were well conducted, and the instruction was quite thorough. The boys were taught reading, writing, arithmetic, English grammar, composition, geography, astronomy, use of the globe, and map and linear drawing. The girls, in addition to reading, writing, arithmetic, the elements of English grammar and geography, were taught plain sewing and knitting. Charles G. Andrews, for many years one of the principals, published a history of the African Free School. The little volume tells of a public examination of the pupils that was held on May 7, 1824, upon which a report was made to the Common Council of the City of New York by a committee appointed from that body. In its report, the committee said, "The undersigned, having attended an examination of the children of the African Free Schools on the 7th instant, pursuant to the invitation of the trustees of that institution to the Common Council, beg leave to state that the exercises consisted of exhibitions in spelling, reading, writing, arithmetic, grammar, geography, and elocution, and of needlework in addition to these on the part of the females. The answers of both boys and girls to questions in the important and useful branches of simple and compound arithmetic, of grammar, and of general and local geography, especially that of our own country, were prompt and satisfactory. The performances in writing were neat, and in many instances highly ornamental. The behavior of the children was orderly and creditable to them and their teachers." Mr. Andrews also quotes from the comments made in the Commercial Advertiser in its issue of May 12, 1824. We had the pleasure on Friday of attending the annual examination of the scholars of the New York African Free School, and we are free to confess that we never derived more satisfaction or felt a deeper interest in any school exhibition in our life. The male and female schools were united on this occasion, and the whole number present was about 600. The whole scene was highly interesting and gratifying. We never beheld a white school of the same age, of and under the age of 15, in which, without exception, there was more order, and neatness of dress, and cleanliness of person, and the exercises were performed with a degree of promptness and accuracy which was surprising. There were 2 or 3 Southern gentlemen present, and we should have been pleased had there been many more. We were particularly struck with the appearance of the female school. There was a neatness of dress and person, a propriety of manner, and an ease of carriage, which reflected great credit upon themselves and their teacher. It would be difficult to overestimate the value of the African free schools to the Negroes of New York, and it is easy to see that it was due mainly to them that there was produced in New York City and State a body of intelligent and well-trained colored men and women ready to assume leadership during the great crisis in the history of their race. The fact that these schools were genuine was very important. In the fight which the New York Negroes waged against slavery, the colored churches of the city played an important part. Long after the close of the Revolutionary War, that the Negro in New York began organizing his own churches and building his own houses of worship. The African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church and Leonard Streets, that the protest meeting against the extradition of James Hamlet under the fugitive slave law was held. The organization of Baptists, Episcopalians, and Presbyterians followed in quick succession. Even a Negro Reformed Dutch church was organized in 1826. This, by the way, is not a matter for laughter. There were a good many Negroes in New York, the descendants of the manumitted slaves of the original Dutch settlers, and who retained much of the Dutch training. There are today in New York Negroes bearing the names Van Vechten, Van Vranken, Van Dusen, Van Dyke, Van Horn, Schuler, and other such honorable Dutch names. The course pursued by the Negroes of New York with respect to the church has been, as Mary White Ovington points out in Half a Man. Footnote: see Mary White Ovington, Half a Man, Longmans, Green and Company, New York, 1911. Directly opposite to their course with respect to the schools, it appears that they found it easier to attain to democracy in education than to reach that end in religion. New York Negroes at first attended the white churches. There they were Jim Crowed in the strictest manner. They sat in the galleries or in certain seats designated for them. They were permitted to receive the communion only after all the whites were through. They had no part in church activities. Listening to the preaching of the doctrines of Jesus Christ under such conditions could not long be tolerated by men of any common sense and decency. So the intelligent Negroes in the white churches withdrew and set up their own churches. This gap between white Christianity and black Christianity has constantly widened. Until today, the accepted general understanding is that colored people shall not join white churches or white YMCAs or participate in any white Christian movement, and of course, vice versa. In education, the course has been the reverse. Negroes started in the African free schools. In 1834, all of the schools and property of the Manumission Society were transferred to the Public School Society. Later, in 1858, all of the Negro schools, taught at that time entirely by colored teachers, were taken over by the newly established Board of Education. We know that as early as 1857, the colored people had begun a fight against segregation and discrimination in the public schools. By 1884, the public school system had absorbed most of these separate schools, and in that year, Grover Cleveland, then governor of the state, signed a bill disestablishing the 3 remaining colored schools as colored schools and providing that they be, quote, open for the education of pupils for whom admission is sought, without regard to race or color. As a result of these developments, the great majority of colored children attended so-called white schools, and many white children attended so-called colored schools. Governor Theodore Roosevelt in 1900 signed a bill with a law permitting communities in the state to establish separate schools and provided that no person should be refused admission to or be excluded from any public school in the state on account of race or color. And so it was that the New York Negroes forced their way from the African Free School, started in a single room, through to full equality in the public school system, and with regard not only to pupils but also to teachers. There are at present more than 300 colored teachers in the public schools of the city. The record in religion is directly opposite. Negroes began by attending the white churches, and today, but for an infinitesimal number of exceptions, there are no colored members of white churches in New York City. Chapter 4. During the period between the abolishment of slavery in New York State, 1827, and its abolishment in the nation, 1863, the condition of the Negro in New York City, as of free Negroes in all northern cities, was anomalous and precarious. He was neither slave nor citizen. He had neither the protection of a master nor full equality before the law. In the earliest decades, free Negroes enjoyed a limited citizenship. They had voted in all of the colonies and states except Georgia and South Carolina. It was in 1723 that a law was passed in Virginia denying them the right. Free Negroes voted in Maryland down to 1783. It was not until 1835 that North Carolina passed a law forbidding to free persons of color the right of voting. In New York, under the original Constitution of the state, adopted in 1777, the right of suffrage was not limited by any distinction of race or color. The question of limiting the suffrage to white voters did not definitely come up until the second Constitution was being drafted in 1821. After bitter debate, free Negroes were granted restricted suffrage based upon the qualifications of the possession of $250 worth of real property, over and above debts and encumbrances thereon. New York did not place Negro voters upon the same plane as white voters until 1874. In the New England states, with the exception of Connecticut, free Negroes voted on the same terms as whites. The steady forcing down of the status of the free Negro in all parts of the country was impelled mainly by 2 conditions of fact: the increase of the number of free Negroes and sporadic insurrections of the slaves. By the census of 1790, there were 59,557 free Negroes in all the states. By 1860, their number had increased to nearly 500,970. This great increase was brought about in 3 ways: partly by the abolishment of slavery in northern states, partly by the flight of slaves to the north, and partly by thrifty and more fortunate Negroes in the slave states purchasing their own freedom and the freedom of others. A great many Negroes gained their freedom by flight. It is estimated that in the 30 years before the Civil War, more than 40,000 of them passed northward through the Underground Railroad stations in the state of Ohio alone. The number of those who were thrifty and fortunate enough to secure their freedom in the slave states was much larger than is generally supposed. By the census of 1860, there were 95,073 free Negroes in Maryland and the District of Columbia. There were 58,042 in Virginia, 30,463 in North Carolina, 18,647 in Louisiana, and even in darkest Mississippi, there were 773. The proportion of free Negroes to slaves had actually decreased. Nevertheless, the black freemen, a wholly negligible element at the close of the 18th century, increased to such a degree in intelligence and power that in the second quarter of the following century they had become a problem. They had become not only a problem to be dealt with through a policy of curtailing rights and privileges, but even a menace to slavery, to be met by rigorous measures of repression and reprisal. A number of intelligent and talented free Negroes in the North became effective anti-slavery agitators. They were among the earliest of those who sought to organize public opinion against slavery and secure action for its destruction. Freedom's Journal was founded in New York by Negro agitators in 1827, 4 years before the appearance of William Lloyd Garrison's Liberator, and 6 years before the organization of the American Anti-Slavery Society. They worked not only among their own people. A dozen or more of them were famed and popular orators on white platforms. Fully half of the latter were New Yorkers: Frederick Douglass, Samuel Ringgold Ward, Henry Highland Garnet, Alexander Crummell, James W.C. Pennington, and 3 or 4 others spoke not only in this country but also in England, where they helped to kindle anti-slavery sentiment. The last 3 named were well-educated men. Garnett finished his education at Oneida Institute, New York. Crummell studied at Cambridge University, England, and Pennington had a degree conferred on him by the University of Heidelberg. It is not difficult to understand the effectiveness of these black men before white audiences. Slavery existed, and here stood these sons of slaves making powerful appeals with unanswerable logic and impassioned eloquence for their millions of brothers held in chains and bought and sold, not in Africa or in some far-off corner of the earth, but here in the United States of America. It was sufficient for the great Frederick Douglass, who gained his freedom by flight, to stand before such an audience and exclaim, "I was a slave. Am I not a man?" Nor were all the noted black agitators men. One of the best of them all, white or black, was a woman, Sojourner Truth. Sojourner was born a slave in Ulster County, New York, about 1798, and was called Isabella. She became a free woman when the state abolished slavery. She drifted to New York City, where, after having a vision one night, she rose up and announced herself Sojourner Truth. Sojourner because the Lord had commanded her to travel up and down the land, and Truth because she was to declare the truth to the people. And a name of what beauty she evolved. Sojourner Truth was one of the most effective speakers of the Anti-Slavery Society. She was pure black and a very tall and striking figure. Her deep voice and mystical manner seemed to have an almost miraculous effect on her hearers. She was a fervent anti-slavery agitator, but her appeal was broader than the question of slavery. It embraced women's rights. Sojourner Truth was a strong factor in the women's suffrage movement. She was present at the Second National Women's Suffrage Convention held in Akron, Ohio in 1852, and made a memorable speech. The Libyan Sibyl, as she was often called, because of her reputed oracular powers and her sublime faith, was a source of inspiration and confidence for the Negro radicals with whom she worked. At a meeting of the leaders held during the war, at which Frederick Douglass was speaking, there was little but pessimism and gloom. Sojourner Truth instantaneously changed the atmosphere of the meeting by interrupting Douglass and thundering out, "Frederick, is God dead?" But the free Negroes did not confine their efforts to agitation. They acted. All along the northern bank of the Ohio River and in New York, Philadelphia, and some other northern cities, underground railroad stations were maintained, and Negroes took active part in conducting them. Some intrepid ones ventured into the South and urged and assisted slaves to make their escape, guiding them by the Star of the North. And even in this hazardous work, all were not men. No one was bolder or more skillful in it than Harriet Tubman, who stands out heroic in character and deeds. Born a slave in Maryland, she escaped in 1849 when she was perhaps 22 or 23 years old, and made her way to New York. She made 19 trips into the South and assisted more than 100 slaves in making their escape. She was a confidant of John Brown. Wendell Phillips relates that the last time he ever saw John Brown was when the latter came to his house and brought Harriet Tubman, saying, "Mr. Phillips, I bring you one of the best and bravest persons on this continent, General Tubman, as we call her." She was several times a guest at the home of Ralph Waldo Emerson. Her work was known and feared by the slave owners, and at one time there was an aggregate reward of $40,000 offered by Maryland slaveholders for her capture. Because of her daring and experience, she was employed in the Secret Service of the Union Army during the war. After the war, Harriet established an old folks' home for Negroes on a piece of property that, in 1857, William H. Seward had sold her near his home at Auburn, New York. She lived to be more than 80 years old and was strong and vigorous up to her death. Contrary to the common idea that the Negro was wholly docile and submissive in slavery, is the fact that almost from the beginning he made repeated efforts to throw off his bonds by force. There were 30-odd definite attempts at insurrection, the earliest dating back into the 17th century. The first serious insurrection of slaves was attempted in New York City in 1712. It was this insurrection that sent the first quiver of apprehension through the colonies. It was also in New York that was planned the second attempt at revolt, which made the whole country shudder. This was the plot of 1741, already spoken of, and termed by Benjamin Brawley in his Social History of the American Negro, quote, "in some ways the most important single event in the history of the Negro in the colonial period." All the other slave rebellions of importance took place in the South. As early as 1722, an armed body of some 200 slaves gathered near the mouth of the Rappahannock River in Virginia to carry out a plan to kill their masters while they were assembled at church. The plot was discovered and frustrated. Slaves in South Carolina armed themselves and broke into open rebellion in 1730 and again in 1739. They burnt houses and killed a number of whites, but themselves suffered the greater loss. The first truly formidable uprising in the South was the Ghetto insurrection in South Carolina near Charleston in 1740. Under the leadership of a slave named Cato, an armed band of Negroes marched for miles, burning and killing. They killed a score of white people before they were subdued by the militia. The chief effect of these earlier insurrections was to frighten the masters and make the lot of the slaves harder through severer regulations. There was little or no effect upon the condition of free Negroes for the reason that their number was at the time too insignificant. But later slave insurrections directly affected the status of free Negroes, North and South. 3 of these insurrections had far-reaching results. In 1800 came the Gradual insurrection in Virginia. 1,000 slaves, led by Gabriel, himself a slave, planned to seize the city of Richmond. The plan was well laid and contemplated the capture of the arsenal and storehouse. On the day set for the uprising, a devastating storm, which swept away bridges and inundated roads, burst over the section, and the greater part of those involved in the plot found it impossible to reach the rendezvous. Most of those who did assemble were daunted by superstitious fears. In the meantime, Richmond was apprised of the revolt and placed under arms. Gabriel and 35 others were executed. In 1822, the better known and better planned Denmark-Vesey insurrection was attempted in South Carolina. Vesey was a man of superior intelligence and of some education. As a boy and young man he had traveled as a sailor. He could read and write, and spoke French as well as English. In 1800, when he was 33, he purchased his freedom for $600. As a freeman, he worked at the carpenter's trade in Charleston and accumulated a sum of money. His spare time he devoted to study. Vesey continued for 20 years to work and study, all the while reflecting upon his condition as a black freeman and upon the condition of his fellow blacks who were slaves. He knew what the Negroes of Haiti had done, for he had been there, and a plan for the Negroes in and around Charleston to do something similar slowly matured in his mind. Late in the year 1821, he sounded out and broached his plan to 2 Negroes in the city. Before the end of the year, the band of conspirators numbered 6. For 7 months, the work of organizing the Negroes, slave and free, inside the city and for miles around, went on with unbelievable secrecy. Vesey's plan in brief was to seize Charleston, wipe out the whites, and free the blacks. Arms were cautiously purchased and pikes were manufactured. The plotters were, of course, relying on the arsenal for their real supply of arms. They were extremely careful about what blacks they approached. One of the rules adopted was that no personal servants should be enlisted. Organization was carried on with the aid of cabalistic words and numbers. Secrecy was so well guarded that the officials of the city were completely deceived about preparations that had been going on for months under their eyes. After a leak of information reached the officials, 2 of Vesey's lieutenants, Peter Poyas and Mingo Harth, were placed under temporary arrest. But they exhibited such extraordinary sang-froid and so laughed at the idea of a slave insurrection that they were released. Another of Vesey's leaders, Ned Bennett, hearing that his name had been mentioned, went voluntarily before the officials and demanded an examination. Of cool courage, history has no finer examples to offer. Events justify the wisdom of the rule to enlist no personal servants, and had it been strictly adhered to, the story would have ended differently. But the whole plot was revealed 2 days before the date set for action, and by a household servant. Denmark Vesey and 34 others were executed, and 43 were deported. Vesey, before his arrest, destroyed all his records and lists of names, and died without betraying a single secret or associate. The best known and the most significant of these slave revolts of the 19th century was the Nat Turner insurrection in Virginia in 1831. This was also the last serious attempt. Among the slaves of Virginia that lived near the edge of the Dismal Swamp was one, a short, powerful black man named Nat Turner. There was no similarity between Nat Turner and Denmark Vesey, though both of them, by similar actions, wrote their names in American history. Vesey was a cultured man, and his influence over his followers was intellectual. Turner, a naturally intelligent man but illiterate, swayed his followers through an influence that was mystical. He was a plantation preacher and gave himself to fasting and prayer. He communed with the spirits and saw visions. He was held as a prophet by the blacks and regarded with superstitious respect by the whites. Vesey appealed to the manhood of his followers. Once, when he rebuked a fellow Negro for bowing low to a white man, the Negro said, "We are slaves." Vesey retorted, "You deserve to be." Nat Turner gathered his followers and inspired them to act by command of God. On the eve of action, he is recorded as saying to them, "Friends and brothers, we are to commence a great work tonight. Our race is to be delivered from bondage, and God has appointed us as the men to do his bidding, and let us be worthy of our calling. I am told to slay all the whites we encounter, men, women, and children. Remember, we do not go forth for the sake of blood and carnage, but it is necessary that in the commencement of this revolution, all the whites we meet must die until we have an army strong enough to carry on the war upon a Christian basis." Turner attempted to carry out the command fully. He and his band, starting in the night, marched from plantation to plantation, dealing death and destruction, sparing no person with the white skin. They destroyed much property and killed more than 60 whites, including a number of children, before they were subdued. They fought a pitched fight with a detachment of militia and United States troops, in which more than 100 of the band were killed. The others fled to the Dismal Swamp. Nat Turner and others were captured, and together with him, 20 were hanged. Each of these forerunners of John Brown, even as he, failed. In the nature of things, they could not succeed. The blacks of Haiti might conquer the handful of white overlords on the island and, at that time, keep the others off. But the situation of the slaves in the United States was absolutely different. Yet these abortive attempts for freedom, even as John Brown's, produced vital and far-reaching results. In no instance did they gain freedom for any slave. Rather, they served to bind the chains of slavery tighter. Restrictions more rigid than ever were placed upon the slaves. Even the privilege of religious assembly, an ancient one, was all but abolished. The slave owners were as vitally affected as the slaves. They became apprehensive and panicky. The specter of murder and massacre came to haunt them, a specter they were never entirely able to lay. But the free Negro was the class most vitally affected. In the South, the rigid regulations laid down for the slaves were applied to the freemen and, naturally, bore upon them harder. All over the South and through the North, sentiment against them grew. In the South, they were a menace. In the North, they became a problem, a combined moral and social problem. And there are few things in the world more annoying. They were regarded with irritation, suspicion, and hatred. In 1827, Henry Clay, then Secretary of State, said in a public address, "Of all classes of our population, the most vicious is that of the free colored." The weight of sentiment of this sort fell heavily upon the free Negroes of New York, constituting as they did the largest body of intelligent and aggressive Negroes